back and forth later today. I'm going to ask everyone if you just allow the presentation to continue to the very end. However, you can post your questions or comments during the presentation, and at the end, we'll address as many as we can get to. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and ask Justin or Rolda to start off. Again, thanks guys for being here today. Whoever would like to start? That be Justin, Rolda?
Sure. It would be Justin.
All right. So first of all, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Edith, and thanks for having us here. We appreciate the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. So, and thank you for that introduction. I think we understood that Mark gave us a preview of some of the questions that we know you had. We had a short presentation here, which we've tailored. Hopefully, will answer at least some of the questions that you have. And then after we're done with the presentation, we'll definitely leave some time for some Q&A. So let me just get started here, and then, Will, I think you have the mouse. Thank you. So we're gonna cover a few things here. Part 500 governance, right? Part 500, that's DFS's cybersecurity regulation. The cybersecurity program, policies and procedures, which is really what our cybersecurity regulation requires. Some basic ground rules about exemptions and compliance, hopefully address some common questions that we get. And then finally, some issues that we've seen lately too with remote working during the pandemic. All right, so let's go ahead and next slide, please. So first, the cybersecurity division. Mark already introduced us. The division was created in 2019. And really, I think one of the things that makes it unusual among regulators is that it is the first division or unit within a regulator that has responsibility for all aspects of cybersecurity across all of DFS's activities. So whether that's enforcement or examinations or guidance around the regulation itself, right? And Mark asked a question before we started here that maybe some of you have as well. Just so you understand, Rolda and her team and the team that she leads are in the banking division, right? So the cybersecurity division is a separate division, along with banking, insurance, and some other divisions. We work on cybersecurity issues across all of the different types of financial services companies, whether it's mortgages or banks or insurance or even crypto companies. With respect to examinations, there are a team of specialist cybersecurity examiners in the division. They assist other divisions from time to time, including, for instance, the mortgage division, handling sanctions or some of the supervision issues. All right, next slide, please. So our cybersecurity regulation, Part 500, was promulgated, it was originally published for notice and comment in 2016 and became effective in 2017. The regulation itself has become a model for a number of other regulators. The NYIC has adopted it as a model insurance cybersecurity regulation. I think we're up to about a dozen states that have enacted that model. The CSBS has also put out a model cybersecurity regulation for non-bank financial institutions, also modeled on DFS's Part 500. And the FTC has proposed safeguard regulation for financial institutions that's also modeled on Part 500. And I think it's been a success in the sense, they say about imitation being the sincerest form of flattery. I think it's been a successful model for regulation, in part because it was drafted with really extensive feedback and collaboration with the industry. There were 2 rounds of notice and comment, dozens of formal and informal meetings, surveys done before the cybersecurity regulation was promulgated. All right, next slide, please. So who is required to comply? I think for obvious purposes here, probably everyone in the audience is. So that may be the most important question that you have about this. If you have any kind of a license, charter, you're registered with DFS, then it applies to you. Notably, and sometimes this is one thing sometimes people ask about, it doesn't apply to third parties that provide services to, DFS licensed financial services companies. So, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Google, big companies. I know companies like Fiserv, Jack Henry, and FIS provide services to financial institutions, sometimes institutions in the mortgage business as well. Those are not directly regulated, although we do have a third-party cybersecurity requirement in our regulation. All right, next slide, please. All right, and then so the cybersecurity regulation, right? One thing to note about it is that DFS's regulation was written to apply to a pretty diverse range of institutions, diverse in size, diverse in business model, obviously mortgage, but obviously including, cryptocurrency, different kinds of insurance companies, check cashers, global banks, small businesses. And so it takes a mostly takes a programmatic view. And one of the key pillars of that is cybersecurity governance, right? The goal is to create a structure where cybersecurity is a focus for the organization and really a focus for management too, right? We don't see effective cybersecurity in companies or in organizations unless there's buy-in from the senior levels of management and the board on making it a priority, right? I mean, you can have the greatest CISO in the world, you can have technical people who know what they're doing, but unless there's buy-in from the leadership, they can't necessarily drive prioritization. The technical people or the information security people can't really drive it as a priority for the whole organization. That has to come from the top. Some of our requirements go to the kind of leadership and governance issues, right? And that includes things like the certificate of compliance, the DFS, board approval of policies and procedures, having a CISO, right? A senior level person who's responsible for cybersecurity, and that also reports to the board directly. And then also training for all employees on cybersecurity awareness to kind of help drive the message, education, but also the message and the prioritization through the organization. All right, next slide, please. And then, all right, I'm going to turn it over here to my colleague, Will, to pick it up from here.
Thanks, Justin. So in addition to the cybersecurity governance being one of the areas of greatest concern, having a cybersecurity program, a risk assessment, policies and procedures to execute the program is also important. Really, a robust cybersecurity program is really critical for effective security management practices and controls. And Part 500 requires each entity to maintain a cybersecurity program, which is designed to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of an organization's information systems, basically the CIA triad. Now, to build an effective cybersecurity program requires a commitment to people, processes, and technology, and all three must be working in concert to support the weight of the program. If one of these areas is lacking, the other two are insufficient to support the program. One of the common problems examiners see out in the field is with IT and cybersecurity strategy is really the notion that adding technology will solve a particular IT or cybersecurity problem. And what many organizations make the mistake at is, or fail to realize, is that the technologies is only as good as the processes to implement it, your policies and procedures, and the people knowledgeable to execute those processes. So, from a governance perspective, definitely buy-in at the top is important, but for a successful program, management really has to have an intentional focus in all those areas. The risk assessment, now that's the cornerstone of our cyber regulation, is the risk assessment. Key components of the regulation, such as the cybersecurity program policies and procedures, penetration testing and vulnerability assessments, business continuity, third-party risk management, training and monitoring, encryption, multi-factor authentication, all of those are driven by the risk assessment. Now, generally speaking, the risk assessment requires an organization to consider a couple of things. First, the organization has to define its risk tolerance to determine what is acceptable and what is not. And then second, they have to identify and assess not only the internal, but the external cyber risks that may threaten all of its information assets within that organization. So, you not only want to look for the bad guys or the hackers that are outside of your organization, you also want to make sure that you're addressing the risk posed by insider threats as well. So the last point I'll make on risk assessments is that it's an iterative process, and that it must be updated as reasonably necessary to address changes, not only to your business operations. So if you're adding new technology, if you're moving to the cloud, you want to make sure that you, recalibrate your risk assessment, but also changes in the landscape. So for example, the recent pandemic and more recently, the supply chain risk resulting from SolarWinds compromise and exchange vulnerability. Companies at this moment should really be revising their risk assessments, reviewing their policies and procedures, and making sure that they're addressing these evolving threats. Sorry about that. So policies and procedures. Policy procedures are really the outline of what is required, expected, and the prohibited activities within an organization. You want to make sure your policies and procedures are clear and easily understandable and communicated to all affected parties, because really they create the governance structure that defines the organization's control environment. From a supervisory standpoint, we're looking to ensure cybersecurity policies really define the roles and responsibilities of information security, the lines of business and IT. For organizations with larger IT shops, like as a best practice, the roles of administrating cybersecurity program should be separate from the operational responsibilities of IT. And that really is just to ensure that, there's clear separation of duties and that stakeholders have a full view of cyber risk. And those decisions are not unduly influenced by, operational ease or budgetary constraints. You want to make sure that your policies provide guidance on acquiring assets, configuring and operating those assets, maintaining them, and also too for auditing those systems. You want to make sure that there's some type of review, at least from a third party or independent review, making sure that your policy procedures are being adhered to and that they're being effective. The last bullet is a link to our financial services toolkit. One of the challenges we see is that small businesses without a CISO have challenges developing really meaningful policies to create a program. So DFS partnered with the Global Cybersecurity Alliance, or GCA, to provide a cybersecurity toolkit for small businesses within the financial services industry. Now, this toolkit includes a set of sample cybersecurity policies based on best practices to really help small organizations bolster their cybersecurity posture and address areas such as risk assessment, asset identification when identifying hardware and software, and really updating the defenses against cyber threats, strengthening passwords, multi-factor authentication, and addressing third-party risks. So, this presentation is recorded, so definitely this link here will provide you to access to the policies that we worked in conjunction with GCA. So other noteworthy requirements of the cyber regulation that we look to assess cyber risk are data governance and classification policy. We want to make sure that a data governance policy should ensure that the organization's data and information assets are managed consistently and used properly. Really, the policy should establish roles and responsibilities for managing data and really articulate the practices that ensure that data is adequately protected. Customer data privacy. This really refers to the privacy controls for controlling access to customer PII and MPI. We want to make sure that organizations have policies and procedures designed to govern the collection and disclosures of customers' personal financial information. And also too, we want to make sure that there are mechanisms in place to detect and mitigate against the unauthorized access to that personal information. For example, having a pre-texting policy would be key to make sure that when customers are requesting information over email or phone or other media, that there's some authentication mechanisms in place. Penetration tests and vulnerability assessment. Those tools are used to assess the effectiveness of a covered entity cyber program. And again, based on a risk assessment and relevant identified risk, organizations should be conducting penetration tests at least annually. And vulnerability assessment should be conducted biannually and really should include a systematic scans designed to identify publicly known vulnerabilities within their organization's information systems. The vulnerability assessment must also be based on an organization risk assessment, and some organizations may employ some ongoing monitoring program, but you just want to make sure that your program is conducting systematic scans of publicly identified vulnerabilities, and that tool that you're using, whatever it is based on a risk assessment. Audit trails, again, those are based on a risk assessment as well. A covered entity, should have systems, secure systems, and it should be designed to reconstruct financial transactions sufficient to support operations and obligations, and also include audit trails designed to detect and respond to cyber events. Now, for the financial records, you want to make sure those are maintained no fewer than 5 years, and cyber records are maintained no fewer than 3 years. Data retention, limitations of data retention. That really refers to the secure disposal and having policies and procedures for periodic basis of disposing of non-public information that's no longer used for business operations or any other legitimate purposes. Now, there are situations where organizations may need to store MPI beyond its intended business purpose. That could be due to other regulatory requirements, or in situations where the systems are stored in a manner that it's not feasible to properly dispose the MPI. So you just want to make sure you have data retention policies and standards, that you have schedules. And also too, I'll just add these two little nuggets too, is you want to make sure that, particularly if you're in a data center environment, you want to make sure that there's data center destruction policies. And when you engage with third parties, you just want to make sure that there's some type of data destruction agreement with your third party, and that may include an attestation of the third party destroying your data. Incident response. So organizations should have a written incident response plan, and that's designed to properly respond to and recover from cyber events, including those that have a material effect on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems or business operations. Now, your incident response program, or what we call IRP, should have defined protocols to declare and respond to an identified incident, have measures to contain the incident, also should have measures for preserving data and evidence, and also should have a plan in place to coordinate with law enforcement, notify your regulators and third parties, and also too should have a plan in place for restoring systems, and also providing assistance to customers, and otherwise facilitating operational resilience with institutions. So an effective way to validate an incident response program, the cheapest way to do it is to actually conduct tabletop exercises. Now, typically tabletop exercises is where an organization runs through scenarios based on past events or current events with your appropriate internal and external parties. That's really a most effective way to help management discover and resolve possible gaps in the program, and really determine processes that may identify processes or opportunities for process improvement. Also, too, your incident response plan should enable an organization to quickly detect and respond and recover from cyber and IT incidents, with the goal of minimizing damage to organization and its customers. So this is very familiar to the goals of a business continuity plan, which is also designed to minimize damage to the organization and the customers in the event of a disaster. So you want to make sure that your incident response plan and BCP plans are closely aligned and really have the ability to identify and protect systems itself from threats, potential failures, and also to recover and learn from those disruptive events. So this slide here is talking about cyber reg exemptions. Now, under 519, there are limited exemptions to cybersecurity regulation. The small business exemption applies to organizations that employ less than 10 people, produce less than 5 million in gross annual revenue from New York operations in each of the past 3 years, or has less than 10 million in a year and total assets. Excuse me. Another limited exemption are those that do not directly or indirectly use or maintain or control any information systems and are not required to directly or indirectly control, own, access, generate, or receive or possess any MPI. Just two things to keep in mind from organizations that qualify for exemptions. You still have to file a security notice through our web portal, and just understand that even though you have partial exemptions to the regulation, companies are still required to implement certain elements of the regulation, which includes annual certification. So even if you are exempt, you still have to file for certification. So this table here, or this slide here, is just really just a highlight of the exemptions for 519 A and C. So if an organization is exempt under 519, they're still responsible for a cybersecurity program, cybersecurity policy, a policy for addressing access privileges, risk assessment, third-party risk management, data retention, and notices to the superintendent. So this slide, notices to the superintendent, just things to keep in mind for annual compliance. So even if you file an exemption under 519 A or C, you still must certify compliance annually. Now, companies must submit to the superintendent a certification for compliance covering the prior calendar year, and compliance must be submitted by April 15th and signed by either the chairman of the board of directors or a senior officer. Companies must maintain for examination review of all records, schedules, and data supporting the certificate for 5 years. And for those companies that are unable to certify compliance due to identify areas, systems, or processes that require material improvement, updating, or redesign, organizations must document those identified areas and include a remediation plan or remediation efforts to address those. That document as well must be available for inspection by the superintendent. Now, generally speaking, when an organization has areas that require improvement, it's typically done through like a corrective action plan or some type of plan, which is really a step-by-step plan developed to achieve a targeted outcome. Generally, CAPs, or what they call CAPs or corrective action plans, are linked to either the previous audits, penetration tests, and vulnerability assessments. So you just want to make sure if you have a remediation plan that there's a source for that defines the reason behind why you have to have a plan. Also, corrective action plans typically have a defined workflow. They assign responsibility, or what I say, accountability. You want to make sure that that people that are implementing the plan are held accountable to it. And lastly, you want to make sure it's based on a risk assessment. And this is really important because you want to make sure that you prioritize the high risk issues first that need to be addressed immediately. So those are the types of things I think, high level are some of the things to keep in mind if you ever needed to come up with a plan to make sure, if you ever were not certified and you need to come up with a plan, those are the type of things that you should keep in mind. Now, with respect to reporting cyber events, you are required to report an event, even if you've reported to other agencies, or the event that there's a reasonable likelihood of harming any material part of normal operations. You want to make sure that your IRP or your incident response plan or IRP playbook includes those types of situations. And then last but not least, just a notice of exemption. That's on the Appendix A of the form letter, and that's also available on the website. So Justin, I think that's it. I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Will. One thing I will add about the exemptions, actually, I think there was a question message to us that I may have put a confusing response into, but it is the exemption for 10 or fewer employees is actually it's actually fewer than 10. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's 9 or fewer than 10. Just to clarify that. And then the other point too about that exemption that I like to make sure people understand is that it includes affiliates, right? So it's intended to, affiliates mean any company that has common control. So usually like a subsidiary or a parent corporation or a sibling corporation. So the exemptions are really intended to apply to actual small businesses, not, a local New York office that is of a very large corporation. In other words, if there's only 5 people in the New York subsidiary, but there's a lot more people in the parent who support the business in New York, then it would not necessarily, the exemption would not necessarily apply. I just wanted to clarify that. So with that, any questions? Oh, I see a question. See a question in the chat here, and it's about compliance for smaller companies. Look, I think that's a good question. Obviously, we recognize that there are some aspects of cybersecurity that are definitely harder if you're smaller. Some are harder if you're bigger, actually, which is interesting, which may not apply as much to this audience. But if you have a larger organization, you often have lots of different parts, and keeping track of them is an extraordinary governance challenge. Whereas if you're a small organization, one person can actually remember where all the computers and systems are stored in their head, or keep that information on a single piece of paper. That can be an advantage too. But certainly we recognize that effective cybersecurity, as important as it is, can be challenging for organizations that are so small. For instance, real small businesses that are small enough to be exempt from the requirement to have a CISO. And one of the reasons that, and we'll mention this in the presentation, I think it's worth highlighting again, one of the reasons we partnered up with the Global Cyber Alliance to help to create, template or cybersecurity policies, to work with them, was precisely to try to help small businesses improve their cybersecurity consistent with DFS's cybersecurity regulation. And if you don't know the Global Cyber Alliance, there was a link actually in the chat earlier to it, which I appreciate, to our page. And the Global Cyber Alliance is a nonprofit that focuses on providing cybersecurity advice, help, tools, educational, written and video materials to small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses. That's their goal, and it's a great nonprofit. We work with them. They have a cybersecurity toolkit for small businesses, and we work with them to make sure that it included, template policies that I think are important policies to have for cybersecurity purposes, but also required by our regulation. And we do that, I think, precisely because we talk to a lot of folks who are regulated by DFS, and I think in the news, right, when DFS comes up, it's often referenced to very large corporations, but we at DFS know that we actually regulate thousands of small businesses across the different types of across the financial services industry. By count, that's the overwhelming majority of our licensees and registrants. So I think one of our focuses has been to try to make that more accessible, make cybersecurity more accessible for small businesses. So I'd recommend that, if you are, especially if you're an organization that doesn't, it's too small to have a cybersecurity professional on your staff, like a CISO. If you're in the small business exemptions, you're exempt from the requirement at DFS that you have a CISO. And so the Global Cyber Alliance really, I think, tries to make the goal of it is to make the material accessible to the non-cybersecurity professional, right? To a small business owner or somebody else who's just trying to implement like basic steps to protect their information, their money, and their customers.
All right, well, Justin, thank you for that. I think there's a couple questions out there. Could I ask either of you to respond, whoever feels that they have the answer? I did notice on one of your slides that it said greater than 10 employees. I guess so. That's why there was some confusion, Justin, because on the slide it says greater than 10 for. If you go back to that,
Yeah, it's past it. Sorry.
Yeah.
There it goes.
It says greater than 10.
Yeah. Gotcha.
So
thank you. That sign needs to be flipped. That's the source of the confusion. All right.
So that's
Thanks,
incorrect, Mark. Right?
Yes. Thank you.
So before
that's a very different meaning, I guess. the way the mathematical notation is on the slide. There we go.
Great. All right. So great. I just want to make sure that we're okay with that. And then I guess a lot of us being relatively small shops, of course, there's a feeling of being overwhelmed a little bit. I know the regulation is already 3.5 years old, so but many of us are just kind of developing the best processes and procedures. So let me ask you one of the questions that came from the membership. Can I focus on some of these questions, guys? Just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the questions was, can you share with us what the DFS cybersecurity examinations are revealing currently as to broker compliance? Are you finding you're walking into our shops and you're basically very happy with what you see? Or Are you thinking, well, we really got a long way to go? And are you treating this as more of an educational opportunity for us? Or is this, are we at the punitive stage at this point? Could you share that with us?
Sure, let me see first if Roldan wants to jump in on that one.
Right. So I think this is going to be me, Mark. For the most part, I wouldn't say that we've 100% reached a punitive stage for all brokers. You know, if we've done a cybersecurity examination previously and we advise the entity of steps that were necessary, and we're doing a follow-up exam and that entity hasn't taken any course of action to address, then I would say yes, we may be looking at moving towards a punitive stage because we look at responsiveness to examination findings when we're evaluating institutions. But a lot of what we're seeing really goes to the heart of just an entity understanding its operations. Most brokers are buying off the shelf, what we call off the shelf policies and procedures, but they're not reading them. They're not reviewing them to realize that they don't relate to their operations. Many perform no type of risk assessment of their operations to even determine where the risk lies in their business. And the other aspect is we've identified that there is this lack of knowledge of the LO system that many of them are using. So they don't completely understand it sufficiently enough to customize it so that there is what we call that need to know process, where individuals that don't need access to NPI information are not granted access to NPI information. It runs the gamut. I mean, I could probably go through a laundry list, you know, in terms of things that we've identified. But for us, where we'd like to at least see entities pick up a little bit more is on the risk assessments. We'd like them to begin to focus on looking at their business and identifying on an enterprise-wide basis where their risks are, and then use that to leverage to build out in terms of their policies and procedures, you know, both on a cybersecurity and an operational basis, how they intend to protect the information that they're collecting.
Agreed. And I think most of us are using one loan origination software in particular, and and there are definitely ways to lock down who can see what areas of your business, from financial right down to which processors can see which files and which loan officers can see whose files. So there is a way to lock that down. And that is a simple way to start a compliance program. But another, and this is probably for Deputy Ricketts as well, there's a lot of questions regarding the retention of basically what is public information. So we know what our retention requirements are for non-public information, but a lot of us would like to keep as much marketing data as we possibly can so that we can move forward in the future. And what is our obligation there?
So we just recall, we don't establish any requirements in terms of how long you keep material beyond the 3 years that the department has determined is necessary for us to be able to come in and review your books and records. If an entity wants to keep information longer, they're not precluded from keeping such information for a longer period of time, but the issue still becomes the necessity of maintaining that information and how it's maintained. If we come in and even if it's non-PI and they have data that's being maintained, you know, in areas that we feel anyone can get access to what we call kernels of data, meaning I'm going to start with the public data, And I may be able to then use that and determine this individual conducted business with your company, and what other processes can I do to now fill in the gaps. We're going to raise that as an issue. We're going to raise the fact that you have all of this information on all these borrowers, and you have not taken any steps to either protect or discard if the information is no longer needed. But we don't have any rule or reg that says you must discard the data after a specific period of time as it relates to public information. Sorry.
Okay, good. So that means that a well-secured system where brokers are keeping marketing data is not necessarily a bad thing for anyone involved if it's well secured.
I think Mark, if I can adjust there, I can speak to that with respect to what our cybersecurity regulation requires, which is it does require that the companies periodically dispose of and have a plan and a policy for disposing of non-public information. That's limited to non-public information, so that policy does not apply to information that is public. That said, I think if you were working on a data retention plan or policy, I would be careful about what the definition, both in the DFS cyber reg and in any other applicable regs that might apply. I mean, I'm only an expert on the cyber reg, about what the definition of public information and non-public information is, because it can have a technical definition, right? It might not line up with just your intuition. So if you're going to look to keep information because you believe it fits as public information, therefore, you don't have a requirement to get rid of it. I just, be careful to check the applicable regulations and the actual definitions. There's one in Part 500. There's a provision that specifically defines it that you can take a look at, and I assume that there are probably provisions like that in the other data retention regulations and requirements.
All right. Well, thank you for that explanation, Justin. The thought that all of us have in mind as small brokers or small business entities, we look at Facebook being compromised, Microsoft being compromised, big banks, the Bank of America. These are people who have vast resources available to them, and yet they get compromised. So it's potentially just a matter of when something could happen, not if something could happen. With that being said, what is the process that the DFS follows when a broker reports a cybersecurity breach? What happens? Do you make a phone call? Do you visit the office? Exactly what happens to us? So
that's a good question. And I'm glad you asked it, because in my experience, we do handle this. We have a way of handling this that's, I think, I wouldn't call it unique, but it's not necessarily the same as other regulators. So when you report a cyber incident to DFS, right, we ask people to do that through the portal on our website. It's a one-way portal. So the information you submit goes to us, and then it's not accessible to the outside world. It's not even accessible to you once you put it in. And there is a team here, investigations team, that receives those and responds to them. So that typically, sometimes they'll receive things in the portal that are just determined are not actually cybersecurity events under our reg. People report out of an abundance of caution, or they're in the wrong portal sometimes. But assuming that you've reported an actual cybersecurity event as defined by our regulation, then you would normally get a follow-up from that team. They'll reach out via email or via phone and set up a time to follow up with you, usually by phone. So that's going to be, now I think one thing that I like to stress when I'm trying to explain the process here is, look, we understand obviously that if you've reported an event consistent with what our reg requires the events to be reported as promptly as possible and no more than 72 hours, right? That is, if you're complying with our regulation, that is often going to mean that you are reporting before you have completed your investigation or you have all the facts. So we certainly understand that it's common at the time of the initial report, and sometimes at the time of the initial first follow-up, for a company not to be in a position to have all the facts yet. right? I mean, if you're reporting an event within 72 hours and you tell us you've got all the facts nailed down, that might almost raise an eyebrow. Usually it takes a little time to get everything, to conduct a real investigation. So, you know, depending on the nature of the event, right? If it could be a couple of follow-ups, maybe one initial and then a later one. If it's a relatively simple, straightforward thing, if it's a complicated event or a big event like a ransomware attack or a full compromise of the systems that takes both time for the company to recover from and also time for the investigation to identify what happened, what went wrong, what we can do about it, then the follow-ups might go on, might be a few follow-ups over the course of several months. So if you file a report with DFS, you should expect to be contacted by our incident investigations team. Doesn't mean that's always happens. Doesn't mean you're being investigated. It's just there's always a follow-up from that team if you've reported a qualifying event, and then they do an assessment of that. That information then would be shared with examiners. So the next time, the examiners would be the examiner's responsible. So in this case, Rolda's and her team, if it was a mortgage broker, would be notified of the incident as well. Any summary information that the investigations team had would be made available to the examiners on their next examination. For instance, that's part of our standard process when you do an examination to look at incidents that the company has reported since the last examination, just so the examiners go in knowing what the company has already told DFS. And so it's more than, we do more to follow up on those, I think, than other regulators do. So I like to get a chance to let people know that's normal. I have heard that sometimes they'll file a notice and then they get a call from somebody saying, hey, we're here to investigate the notice. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm being investigated. That's a routine thing that happens after every incident report.
Obviously, brokers want to know that the department will help us make every effort to maintain some business continuity during a cybersecurity breach. And is it generally your intention to allow us to continue to operate if there has been a breach and allow us to attempt to mitigate this ourselves? Or will you be, depending on the size of the breach, I would imagine, will you immediately be instructing us as to how to handle a breach or how to mitigate damages? Can you tell us what has been your experience to date, or have we not had enough experience yet to know what your response would be?
That's a good question. So I should say in the first instance that we are not typically in the, I don't think we are typically or usually or even very often in the position of telling companies how they should be responding to incidents, right? We're typically at a remove from the folks who are responding. Like I said, we understand that a company that's in the middle of responding to an incident is going to need some time to collect the facts and report them back to us, right? So we're not usually in the posture of, I mean, quite frankly, usually we understand that they're going to need some time to respond to the incident and to address it. So we're not usually in the posture of getting into the incident response while it's happening and, indicating to the company, okay, well, we think you should be doing this, or we think you should be doing that. In other words, we're not an incident response operation like if you hired a consultant or brought us in, right? We're almost never in that position. I will say that, when we do find ourselves, in a position where we think the company should do something, it's usually because, number one, we don't think that they have adequately investigated the incident, what happened and what caused it, which is important because if you don't understand what caused it, then you can't really be sure it's the same thing isn't going to happen again, right? I mean, an incident, and we all know what pen testing is, right? An incident is, in a sense, a very expensive pen test. Something bad happened. And now you know that, at least perhaps one of the silver linings, now you know something bad happened and you should be able to fix it, right? But to do that, you have to do an assessment. You also have to make sure that you've complied with various legal and regulatory requirements like consumer notifications, right? Our reg doesn't require consumer notifications, but the New York Shield Act does. And so, if you haven't done your due diligence in the investigation, you often won't be able to take the appropriate consumer protection steps. And then finally, if you don't have a thorough understanding of what happened, then it's difficult to remediate. It's difficult to fix your systems. And I think the supervision teams, in the wake of some incidents, have gone to some companies and said, look, I think, based on this incident, we'd like to hear what you did or to fix it, and we'd like to understand, what that forth, or express concerns if they didn't think it went far enough. Now that's not the typical case. Obviously, I'm just saying that's something that could happen, report or a response. But in terms of being involved in the incident as it's happening, I don't think we've ever had a case where we told a company that they need to shut down their systems. Usually that's a very fast-moving decision that the company is making on its own, like in the middle of a ransomware attack, for instance. And we're usually waiting for the after-action report on that.
All right, let's keep going with these questions. Great, thank you for the thorough answers. This one may be fairly simple. Under the small business exemption, do you need to qualify based on all 3 items or just by one of the 3? It's a question from the membership.
Just one. It's an or.
It's an either or, so that's good.
Yeah.
And many of the brokers are using consultants for this purpose, which is a good thing because many of us are not cybersecurity knowledgeable in all of these areas. So with that being said, many of the consultants employ monitoring of our systems. If someone is having monitoring of their system done, are they required to continue to have vulnerability testing if they have ongoing monitoring?
Well, I think to answer that question, I guess one thing that is monitoring can mean different things, right? In the cybersecurity context, there are many different kinds of monitoring. You can buy lots of tools that do different kinds of monitoring. So I think it depends a little bit on. So I guess without further understanding what is meant by monitoring, it's a little bit tough to answer. It's tough to answer that question, right? And what the trade-off is. I think that you mentioned vulnerability testing. I do think that every organization has to have some means of sort of identifying and fixing vulnerabilities in its software, and its systems and its network and its hardware. So for instance, antivirus is a form of monitoring. It checks for antivirus, but that's not a substitute for vulnerability testing, for sure.
I suppose there could be physical aspects to the vulnerability testing, such as employees just having data that they're not entitled to have or receive. So,
right. I think that's.
I understand that. I think I was specifically talking to the cyber end of it, the computer end of it, but there are other aspects. Thanks for that answer. So there's a lot of question on this. Okay, I get this question almost every other day. Are limited exempt entities required to perform penetration testing? And if so, how often?
I think they're required.
Whoever wants to answer that one.
Me?
Sure. Rhoda, if you want.
So I was gonna actually answer that one. So I believe that while in the regulations, these entities may not be required to do it. For our brokers, they're required to do it. We direct people back to the Grime-Leach-Bliley Act and the safeguard rules, which requires a form of testing if they operate systems that are outward facing and that can be accessed externally.
Okay, so those people who do not have outwardly facing systems where they don't have a website that allows the input of data, are those brokers still required to do penetration testing if they have no outwardly facing systems?
Yes, if they can access remotely. So the system would actually have to be locked down from remote access.
Completely.
Not just whether there's a website or there's a consumer, it would literally have to have no remote access capability.
Okay, well, that was one of the big questions that people have been asking, is on the penetration testing, because it is very expensive, and many brokers, again, we don't have the resources of a Bank of America or a large institution. So I guess it's up to each individual broker. And do you consider the size, scale, and scope of the operation regarding these penetration tests? Or do you have a standard for what this penetration test should cover? That would be probably Rolda.
We require an annual penetration test. The expectation is that the test that's performed is actually across the broker system, designed to determine whether or not there are security loopholes or the ability for an entity or individual to access remotely. It's effective a breach. Can someone breach your system and access the NPI data? We also ask for there to be an internal review to determine whether or not someone who comes into the broker's operations as a vendor and sits at a desk can actually breach the system. In terms of specifics, exactly what's going to be tested, some of that's mostly going to be dictated by the system, by what the broker has. Some have transactional websites that are outward facing, where they're taking applications and NPI data. Some individuals are simply just using, have the LO system on laptops where loan officers can take information and then submit that information remotely. But some of, in terms of the testing and what happens, that's going to be really driven by what each individual broker has in place.
And this question is for you too, Deputy Ricketts. How compliant have brokers been with all of this cybersecurity to this point? Are we 50% of the way there? Are we mostly there? So
that's a difficult question really to answer when you're looking at a population of almost 500. The challenge is that, and then you're looking at the associated MLOs. Some of the challenges really is twofold. It's the broker being compliant, and then the broker ensuring that their LOs are compliant. So, in an exam process, we'll find LOs who have not filed exemptions. And brokers have not filed bulk exemptions on behalf of those LOs if they're large enough to file a bulk exemption, which means 50 or more individuals. We also find that, and I said this before, brokers, because they submit the small business exemption, they're not paying attention to the other components of the reg that they're required to comply with. They take the concept of exemption to mean I don't have to do anything, but there are provisions of the reg that they must comply with. So it's across the board. I wouldn't say that you're 50% in any direction. The brokers as a group, there's still more work to be done. I would like them to at least begin a focus of assessing their risk and then using that risk assessment to begin to develop some form of a cybersecurity or operational policies that address, what's needed to protect NPI data. As previously stated, we have a link on our website to tools that could assist as the smaller brokers. But at a minimum, they need to literally begin to look at their business and assess the risk within their business, not just buy an off-the-shelf document with words and say, okay, I can present this to the department and everything will be okay.
And I think that goes with everything, all your policies and procedures and so forth, not just the cybersecurity. It's not just about having a policy, it's about finding a policy that fits your business and actually working that policy on a day-to-day basis. There's been some questions regarding Calyx software and other vendors that mortgage brokers use on a regular basis, and attempting to try to get all their vendor information from them, especially the lenders we work with. We know we have a compliance requirement to collect vendor data on their security and their systems, and it's just impossible for many of the brokers to get information on some from these lenders. Is it reasonable to assume that these lenders have had to comply in some way with whatever regulatory body that they currently report to when we cannot get data from a lender? That would be a roll of question.
Yeah, I don't think that you want to broadly take the position that if I can't get something, it means the company is in compliance. You know, and this came up before, and I believe I addressed it by explaining that the brokers need to maintain a record that documents their attempts to secure this information. And I think that has been some of the challenge. Many will say we tried, but they can't demonstrate that they in fact tried. They should have copies of communications to the company where they've made the request for the information. If they have a specific contact individual at the company that they liaise with, they should have emails or evidence of the communication between them and that individual where they've requested the documentation in support. But they definitely need to keep a file for each vendor that identifies the vendor, the services that's provided, or their interaction. So where it's the lender and they're forwarding loans to the lender, then they need to identify it as such, what information is sent to that lender, and what steps that they've taken to obtain proof of compliance from those lenders, or that the lenders have systems that are effectively secure. I believe a lot of the lenders ask brokers to prove their compliance. I think at that same time, brokers could be asking the lender, in response to my providing you with this information, I would like to get confirmation that you also maintain a compliance system.
Yes, and this holds true for also your other service providers, right down to your personal technology provider. Most of us have a technology person that comes to the office and manages either the repair or proper operation of our systems. Those people also need to have, or the brokers are required to get data from these individuals as well. Again, we understand that it's usually a little easier to get information from these folks than it is from, let's say, a giant entity. But I like your idea. We can definitely show that we are attempting to do that and have attempted to do that, at the very least.
Mark, if I could, I could say something too about the kinds of cybersecurity problems that we're seeing out there. And especially I would say generally, and I'm speaking a little bit more broadly than just the mortgage group, which Rolda is obviously the expert in. But when we look at the incidents that are being reported to DFS and the problems that we see, right? One of the things that we see is, still one of the number one sort of incident that occurs or gap that leads to an incident is still MFA. Either a problem in its implementation or its incomplete implementation, or that an entity is exempt. And I think Rolda put this very well, right? You could be exempt from the actual MFA requirement, but that doesn't mean that MFA isn't actually appropriate for your situation. I think when the reg was first being drafted in 2016, MFA was a little bit harder and more expensive to get than it is now, where it's built into almost all products. We see a lot of, that's still, I mean, that is still the number one driver. It's just a lack of MFA, or MFA that isn't actually it's implemented for some people at the organization, but not everybody, or, you know, it's implemented for access to email, but not access to your files, you know, or something like that, that leads a gap that someone gets into. That's the number one kind of incident that we see. Most of what we see as, you know, as preventable cyber incidents, and almost all the ones we are driven by MFA. And I would say after that is probably just patching and vulnerabilities and keeping your stuff up to date. You know, what I say to both individual small businesses, and it's true in large organizations, it's a different kind of problem, is as much as possible, make sure your stuff is updating automatically. We all get those prompts, like your computer wants to update, your phone wants to update. You know, if you're especially if you're just thinking about this as an individual or as a small business, trying to get as much of that stuff set to automatic as possible is going to help you a lot, because one of the number one ways that individuals and small businesses get compromised is they just aren't updated to the latest system, right? Each of those updates contains security fixes. That's why you got to put it on your computer. But just so you understand how this works, when the update is made public, the bad guys can see it too, right? And they go to work on this, they can see, they can take it apart and see what security problems it fixes. And then they can go to work exploiting those. So if you're not updating after, you know, Apple puts out an update for your iPhone, or Microsoft puts out an update for your laptop, it's just a matter of time before the bad guys start cruising the internet, scanning the internet, looking for people that haven't updated and popping them. That, you know, and not reusing passwords. I mean, I think those are the kinds of things, in terms of what's leading to incidents in small businesses, those are the big drivers.
All right, that answered a lot of the questions. We do have a multitude of questions that I'm looking on my screen, which with regard to, what if I have a fancy this or a fang-dangled that, and I've got super duper bit technology and all this other stuff. The bottom line is, I guess it doesn't matter how big or how small or how complex your systems, your processes or procedures, you still, all of us are subject to this regulation. And regardless of the size of your organization or your scale or your scope, there's going to be a minimum that is going to be required of us. So for all those people who have asked, what if I have this and what if I have that? The requirement, I would say, still remains the same. And it's so individual, this cybersecurity requirement, based on how you function. It's hard for our regulators to really put a finger on what you specifically should be doing. Am I right, regulators?
Yes.
Right. It's what I mean. You can always report. You can always, a regulator can always put their finger on a policy or the procedure. They can look at your reports and records. They can look at your consumer disclosures, and there shouldn't be too much dissimilarity between brokers. It should all be fairly similar. We all have these same similar requirements. But where we all tend to separate is when we get into the intricacies of our cybersecurity program based on how we operate. So a lot of this is where mortgage brokers find this to be probably the most confusing part of the regulation. Not only is just a subject matter complex for many of us, and some of us didn't grow up with computers in their bedroom like me. And so we've had quite a straight up learning curve on all of this. But we appreciate the time that the department has spent putting this together for us. It's a huge asset to us to have the department who's put together basically the cybersecurity regulation for a lot of entities throughout the entire United States. We really appreciate the fact that you've come on to help us understand what your position is on how you're handling the regulation or this regulation, how you're proceeding forward with examination. I do have one last question on behalf of the membership, because this is another huge question I get all the time. What about those folks who have had a major failure and it's the result of the entity just failing to demonstrate that they have been in compliance with the regulation? Can you give us an example of some of the actions that have been taken, or if you can't do that, some of the actions that you could take on a broker who doesn't comply for whatever reason? That would be you, Rolda, I would imagine. Oh,
I would want Justin to jump in and say the things that he's proposing that to do. You know, the regulations and New York law allows us to take a penalty against companies. So I would direct people to look at section 44 and 44A of the Departments of the banking law as it relates to penalty and what the amount of penalty can be based on. In terms of, I said this previously, if we've reviewed a company and provided them with guidance, the examination report and the findings, it isn't to be taken simply as a punitive report where the department has given me a poor grade and I should disregard it, because that's not me. The reports generally provide recommendations and guidance that companies can follow. And we do align them based on the size of the company that we examined. So where we've provided that type of guidance before and a company took no action, was not responsive, made no corrective action, I would say that company in the situation you described would more than likely find that the department would be moving towards an enforcement action and possibly a penalty. And that doesn't mean a first-time company may not experience the same thing. The difference is a company for the first time where we've identified an issue, there's been a breach. We would look at that company's responsiveness, the action that they've taken to address the breach. What did they have in place? Did they have something in place, or was it just simply, I've been operating and despite the cybersecurity rules, I've completely disregarded any recommendations made by the regs, my industry counterparts, or anyone that has come in to review or examine me. But I wouldn't say that we just automatically make a decision that we're going to penalize a company without literally looking at the underlying. And I don't want brokers to operate in that space thinking that, well, it doesn't matter, I'm going to be penalized anyway. I really want them to operate more in the space of, I'm going to do whatever I possibly can to comply and to develop a proper system to protect consumers' information. The key here is the protection of consumer information. And in addition to our cybersecurity reg, you have the FTC's website that put out a lot of information for small business relating to safeguarding NPI. There are websites out there that can educate smaller business in terms of cybersecurity, breaches, what happens, what to expect, incident responses, plans. And I strongly suggest that the industry avails itself of the information on the FTC, the FFIEC, the Federal Reserve. There are a number of regulatory bodies that have information out there. But the short answer would be yes, we could potentially move to an enforcement action and a penalty, and depending on the severity, the responsiveness, the lack of responsiveness, we could move to revocation of a license. That is the ultimate.
Okay, that would be the ultimate. Well, okay.
That doesn't say we're doing that, Mark. I'm just saying that those are all the tools available to the department.
I understand completely.
Yep.
It sounds like the department is currently in educating the broker mode, and I can appreciate that very much. We all appreciate that. we recognize we have a ways to go with this. And Justin, you were about to pipe in with something.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I agree with Rhoda, and she's obviously the in charge of this area of regulation at DFS. With respect to kind of the broader cybersecurity regulation, I could say, when it was promulgated, there was an understanding that it was the first regulation of its kind in the financial services industry. That's why it was promulgated in collaboration with industry. I think that the sense was, the regulation by its design took 2 years to phase in. Different parts of it, became effective on a rolling basis. That was all in reflection of the fact that we understood that that there was going to be a learning curve. And I think that, we do think that it is, compliance though is very important with this area. I mean, I think that, to the extent there was any doubt, I think it's recent events, whether it's the SolarWinds or the Microsoft Exchange hacks, have made it pretty clear that it's quite possible that the next great crisis in the financial system could be the result of a cyber attack. It's really the next frontier, and not just for the protection of consumer information, which is super critical, but even in some ways the functioning and the stability of the financial markets and the financial services system. So we do think it's important, and we appreciate having the opportunity to come out, I think, and explain what we're seeing and where we're at. I think we're still working with we still understand that the industry is working to address the threats and make sure that they're fully compliant with the regulation. But that said, now that we're 3 or 4 years into it, in cases of serious non-compliance, we are considering enforcement actions. Published recently, a publicly announced enforcement action against residential mortgage services, and that one, you can see the complaint, it's on our website, but that one is based on a few things. I'll point out 2 of them. One is that they had an incident and they did not conduct a follow-up investigation or check to see if any sensitive information had been accessed or could have been accessed until a team of examiners, a team of Rolda's examiners during an examination discovered that they'd had these events, and then didn't do that analysis, therefore didn't report it to DFS or to anybody else, or notify consumers that were potentially impacted. And going back to something else that Rolda said earlier too, they also had not done a risk assessment, which is one of the core requirements of Part 500. So that's, that, like I said, that was a public action. So that information is all public as well.
Let me ask one other question, because Rolda, at what point are all of the LOs supposed to be back taking applications where the license is hanging? Because we have a lot of folks still working remotely. Have you set a date for when that happens?
No, and just so that the industry understands, they will not. We don't have any intentions to do it in a way that catches them off guard. So I don't want anyone to believe that they wouldn't get ample notification. We haven't set a date, but when we've determined a date, industry will be given ample notification to begin the process of getting LOs back into assigned workspace. I'm not sure if you are aware, there's a much lengthier discussion that's being undertaken right now with regards to whether or not we will allow this remote work to continue into the foreseeable future. And once a determination is made with respect to the department's policy in that area, we'd also put that out publicly on our website and communicate it to industry.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And there's been some questions on suggestions for working remotely safely from home. I presume if you're working from home on a laptop that you have a VPN directly into your loan operating system at the very least, along with a host of other things. That's something for the membership. If you're asking questions on that, that would be a question for your cybersecurity, your personal office cybersecurity expert, not so much the department. And I think that is all the questions. Does anyone from the department have any parting thoughts for all of us? I'd be happy to hear anything from Rolda, whomever. Well,
I'll say mine, and then I don't know if Justin wants to say anything. I do want the industry to understand that examinations are ongoing. We are not physically, we're not conducting the examinations on site, so we're not physically showing up at anyone's business location, but examinations continue to occur in this time frame. We send out first day letters, so we're following the old protocol. Individuals should respond and provide the information as directed. We have established a secure portal to receive the information, and companies would be given access to that secure portal.
All right, so that means, brokers, you heard it. The examinations are continuing. May not necessarily be in person, but there will be examinations. All right, Justin, do you have anything else to add?
First, someone, I saw in the message someone asked MFA, that's multi-factor authentication. Sorry for dropping into cyber acronyms there. That means, like, in addition to a password, having like a PIN code, texted to you or emailed to you or that sort of thing. Beyond that, I just wanted to say thank you. Thanks again, Mark, and to all the folks who are here. Appreciate getting the opportunity to address everyone.
And thank you all, Justin, William, and Rolda. Thank you again for the many, many times that you have worked with us, presented material to us, and assisted us in understanding what is now pretty complicated regulatory information. So thank you all for attending. And please, brokers, don't forget that we fully intend to have our 33rd annual Regulatory Compliance and Conference Trade Show, which is going to be at the Westchester Marriott on July 13th, 2021. Thank you all for attending. Have a safe and happy holiday. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.